it strikes me as like really dystopian, right? Where, I can go to my daughter and go, well, don't worry. Yeah, houses are really expensive, but someday grandma and grandpa will die and you and your cousins can share this place.
There are so many millennials out there living what looks to be comfortable middle-class lifestyles, but their salaries alone could never cut it. Hi, and welcome to The Missing Middle. I'm Sabrina Maddow, filling in for Kara Stern.
And I'm Mike Moffat.
Today, we're talking about the Great Inheritance Lottery and how boomer wealth is reshaping Canada as they begin the biggest wealth transfer in Canadian history.
But before we begin, don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment. We'd love to hear from you.
So, Mike, picture this. You're 35, working full-time, maybe balancing a side hustle, paying your rent, it eats up half your paycheck, paying down student debt, and just generally trying to stay afloat. And then one day, your parents casually tell you they're going to help you buy a house. Or maybe they're leaving you a $1 million inheritance. Suddenly, everything changes.
That sounds way too good to be true.
See, but here's the wild thing. This isn't just some far-flung fantasy or daydream anymore. It's actually happening on a massive scale. We're about to see nearly $1 trillion, that's trillion with a T dollars, moving from baby boomers to their heirs, mostly millennials, by 2026. That's just in the next 2 years. And there's so much more to come. Here's the thing. This isn't just about trust fund kids anymore either. Get this. Ipsos did a survey that found that among Canadian boomers who plan to leave 100% of their inheritance to their kids, the average will be $940,000. There are going to be a lot of millennials and Gen Z who come into not just wealth, but life-changing wealth. Mike, are we witnessing the most significant economic redistribution in Canadian history?
Yeah, it's certainly possible. But I would caveat this with a couple of things. That first, many of those baby boomers are going to have long retirements, which is great for them. They're going to, we've had more people in history, live into their 90s, live to over 100. But what that means is they're going to have a lot of expenses. So that money might not go as far as we think, or be as large as we think, because as that pocket of savings is drawn down, at the end of it, there might not be much left because we know how expensive long-term care is and out-of-pocket health expenses and that kind of thing. But the other aspect of it is that not every millennial or Gen Z is going to get that inheritance, right? That some people are new to Canada, their parents aren't here. Some people are estranged from their parents. Some people have 5 or 6 siblings, maybe less than in history, but that can happen as well. So I kind of worry about the inequality portion of that, where some people are going to get this big inheritance, but others, for a variety of reasons, are going to be left in the cold.
So for those who are going to get an inheritance, where is all this wealth actually coming from?
Well, it's coming from a few places. So you have a lot of folks who are teachers or nurses or other jobs that have defined benefit pension plans, which are largely going extinct in the private sector, but still exist in the public sector. And many of them are quite generous. They're kind of, despite folks being retired, they're actually building up savings in their retirement because those pension plans are paying them more than they cost out. Obviously, there's a lot of RRSP wealth that people have inherited over time if they made good stock market picks. You do have the occasional senior who bought Bitcoin at the right time. Not that many of them, but there are a few. But the obvious one is real estate wealth, and that could come from primary residences. So you got those folks who bought a home in Cabbagetown in the 70s for under $100,000. That's now 3-4 million or whatever.
Must be nice.
That would be nice. That would be very, very nice. Unfortunately, I was not one of the folks who did that. But you've also got some folks who bought investment properties who not only had their primary residence, but they had 2 or 3 or 4 other homes or a cottage that they would rent out, and those have appreciated massively as well.
So it seems like if your boomer parents own a home or maybe a couple homes, you're basically set up to be significantly wealthier than your peers whose parents aren't homeowners. Meanwhile, getting together a down payment these days without family help, it's nearly impossible. Are we headed towards some kind of permanent two-tier society in Canada?
Yeah, that's what I'm really worried about. I think that's a legitimate fear, that over time it's becoming more and more important who your parents are, rather than your own skills, your own talents, that kind of thing. I look at my parents, who met in Whalen Corners, Ontario, which is a little community of 3 farms, right? And they grew up in circumstances that were very, very modest, but they were able to build middle class lives for themselves. And then from that, my sister and I were able to do more. Particularly my sister, who makes way more money than I do, but that's a topic for another episode. But overall, that you've got these people who could do those kinds of things because housing was cheap back then, even 20, 25 years ago, and we can kind of climb that ladder. I look at it today, and again, I'm not that old. I'm only 47. I couldn't do what I did back in 2004. I might still be living with my parents. So that's going to be a problem, that, if you want to move to a more expensive city, if you want to take that job opportunity, you want to take that internship, you're only going to be able to do that if your parents finance you. So that's what I've seen. That's the Gen X perspective. So what's the millennial perspective? Like, what are you seeing among you and your peers?
Well, it's amazing how quickly things have changed because you really only have just over a decade on me. And by the time you get to my generation, the only friends and coworkers my age who own homes have had some type of family help, every single one of them. That might have been an inheritance, it might have been gifted money, or it could just be co-signing on a mortgage. However, most of us, including myself, are still renting. But here's something else I've been noticing, and it only comes out in these casual conversations when people let their guard down because people are very hesitant to admit it. Everyone talks about traditional inheritances, someone passes away and leaves money. But there's this whole other thing happening that we don't discuss as much, and that's giving while living, which I like to call the invisible inheritance. And so what I mean by that are boomer parents who are still covering part of their adult kids' credit card bills well into their 30s, even 40s. They might be paying for full vacations, wedding costs, daycare, summer camp for kids, even basic stuff like cell phone bills. There are so many millennials out there living what looks to be comfortable middle-class lifestyles, but their salaries alone could never cut it. It's all being quietly subsidized by their parents. So when I think about that, it seems like these invisible living inheritances are distorting the reality of what the middle class actually is in Canada, especially for younger generations. And that makes me wonder, is the middle class becoming something you inherit rather than earn? And if that's true, can we even call it the middle class anymore?
Yeah, I worry about that. Now, I think we should point out that it has always been the case that some parents help their adult children. And I can be testament to that because I spent way too long in grad school, and I got support here and there, but it was relatively modest, and that's not a reflection on my parents, who are very, very generous people. It's just that I didn't need that much, right? That I could still earn. The cost of living was relatively inexpensive. So yeah, okay, you get help with a bill here and there, but that is kind of attainable for most people who have good relationships with living parents. But what's really changed is the level of support that's required. Instead of being $50 here, $100 there, you're talking about thousands and thousands a month. But I should also point out that this is actually primarily a Southern Ontario, Lower Mainland BC phenomenon, right? If you're in Edmonton or Regina, a lot less support is needed. That the cost of living is lower, and in many cases, the salaries are higher. But I do worry about the fact that as all the Ontarians move out there, and we've seen that over the last 4 years, 100,000 Ontarians on net have moved to other parts of Canada. So 100,000 more people have moved out than moved in. That we're going to just drive up home prices there. And you see that in the data that, home prices are relatively flat in the GTA, in Calgary and parts of Atlantic Canada and so on. They're up 10% year over year. Rents are up or so on. So this kind of Southern Ontario, Lower Mainland BC phenomenon is really spreading throughout the country. And I'm an economist, so I tend to think about these issues through through that kind of lens of inequality. I tend to think through the impacts on the labor force and through consumption and income inequality, right? So kind of dollars and cents, the kind of thing that you could put on an Excel spreadsheet, right? But something I know that you've talked about a lot is the impact that this is having on the social contract of Canada. So, all of those kind of social sciences that the rest of us economists often disdain. But can you walk us through what you mean by that? Like, what do you see happening to Canada's social contract?
You know what's really interesting about this whole situation is we're not just seeing tension between generations anymore, which has been building for a while, millennials versus boomers. It's creating this new divide within generations that we're just at the start of. So you've got, like you said earlier, millennials who are going to inherit substantial amounts of money, and then a lot of millennials who aren't. And that's affecting everything from political views to how much faith people have in our institutions. We're seeing that breakdown in the social contract. That's not just an economic issue. It's about the entire promise of Canada, that everyone gets a fair shot, regardless of who their parents are, that growing up as a millennial, if you went to school, you worked hard, you got a good job, you'd be able to afford a home and afford to have a family. And when people feel like their success depends more on their parents' wealth and their own efforts, it breeds this kind of cynicism and resentment about everything, government, institutions, the entire system. And this is part of what we've been seeing play out in the polls with young people. There's been this massive swing to supporting the Conservative Party on a federal level. But if you dig into that data, it's not necessarily that young people have suddenly, over the course of the year, massively shifted to conservative values. It's more that they're so frustrated with their economic situation, their lack of access to housing, to starting a family, they're living paycheck to paycheck, or they're in massive debt. This has led to them just seeking any other type of solution. It's this lack of faith of what's currently working in government and institutions. And that's particularly playing into the strain of populist conservatism we're seeing, where it's almost more about tearing down institutions than building up new solutions.
Yeah, and I see that a lot as well. So I've taught fourth year undergraduate for almost 20 years now. So I basically spent almost 23 years hanging out with 23-year-olds, right? So you kind of get a sense of how their views shift over time, right? This kind of cohort effect. And I should say that this is, at Ivy Business School. So these are our students that are, disproportionately going to go into the top 1%. And I would say, a decade ago, let's say the early 2010s, there was this very kind of Obama-ish, I'd almost call it like Leslie Knope kind of like hope and change and optimism. And they would admit that things were wrong, right? They'd have sympathy for things like Occupy Wall Street, right? That I would say, okay, yeah, some of these institutions have gone off the rails. We need to reform them, but basically, there's a lot of opportunity out there, and we're going to change the world, and we're going to make this a better place. Which I always, to be honest, I always had trouble relating to that as a Gen Xer because we are a very kind of gloomy generation. I'm like, oh, these guys are just so optimistic and so brimming with positive enthusiasm. My current cohort and the ones I've had in recent years, the kind of Gen Z, they actually remind me more of us, of the Xers, where they are kind of like, yeah, everything's broken, everything sucks. That these institutions are beyond repair, and they need to be burned to the ground. So it's a very sort of populist vibe. I would say that there are far more people of this cohort who lean conservative than 10 years ago. But I also think there's more polarization, that you also get more kind of like Bernie Sanders type, on the left. And again, this isn't a business school where you get some who are looking for more kind of far left solutions, but they're still coming from the same place, that our institutions are broken, nothing's working, that governments are there to help out, the top 5 to 10 to 15%. They're there to help boomers, not to help them. So I'm absolutely seeing that. And I wanted to ask you about that generational inequality, because again, I know my students are feeling it, that the fact that they believe that our society and our politics is set up to benefit boomers at their expense. So how do you see that, and what do you think people understand and don't understand about that?
So I've covered generational inequality in the housing crisis for some time now, and let me tell you something that really drives me nuts. Whenever I write about these subjects, there's always these comments that say something along the lines of, well, millennials will inherit their parents' money eventually, so what are they really complaining about? Don't worry about it. But here's the reality check. First off, like we've talked about, not every millennial is going to inherit significant wealth or any wealth. And even those who will, the timing is completely off for so many of us. Like, think about it. So many millennials are now in their 30s, again, early 40s. Their boomer parents are in their 60s, maybe early 70s. So by the time a lot of this wealth actually changes hands, many millennials are going to be pushing 60 themselves. Getting a financial windfall at 60 is great and better than nothing. Don't get me wrong, I'd take it. But how does that help someone trying to start a family or buy their first home in their 30s? We're talking about millennials who might not inherit until after their prime earning years, way past the age when they wanted to have kids, start a business, put down roots. So I have to ask, even if these massive inheritances do eventually come through, isn't that like closing the barn door after the horses have bolted? Can inherited wealth arriving decades from now undo the economic damage being done to younger Canadians right now?
Yeah, I don't think it can. I think this is highly, highly problematic. And again, I like to relate this to my own life. That I'm lucky enough that both my parents are still around and still healthy. But I'm 47, right? I don't need that help. And I think one of the things that we may see is actually skipping generations, right? Where it's not so much boomer parents passing away and helping their kids, but rather boomer grandparents 10 or 20 years from now helping their grandkids through inheritance that way. But it strikes me as like really dystopian, right? Where I can go to my daughter and go, well, don't worry. Yeah, houses are really expensive, but someday grandma and grandpa will die and you and your cousins can share this place. Like, if that's our solution to the housing crisis, I think we have a problem as our society. Like, that just strikes me as incredibly dystopian, where we're basically having to tell a generation of teens and people in their early 20s, it's like, okay, you can either have living grandparents or a home, but you can't have both.
Yeah, it sounds like something from a horror movie script rather than a functioning democracy. Well, on that positive note, we'll wrap it up. Thank you so much, everyone, for watching and listening, and to our wonderful producers, Meredith Martin and Kara Stern.
And if you have any thoughts or questions about housing and politics and inheritances, please send us an email at missingmiddlepodcast@gmail.com.
And we'll see you next time.